Hello there, and welcome back to GameDev Building Blocks. This is episode 5, where we continue our discussion of functions. Last week we talked about parameters, which are these arguments, or also known as parameters, that functions can take, and that will modify your function in some meaningful way. And we saw how that allowed us to create functions that were even more flexible than the ones that we made 2 weeks ago. Now, this week we're going to continue talking about functions, and this time we're going to talk about what's called the return value. Okay, so in computer science, functions are allowed to and oftentimes will have a return value, or a lot of times we say that this function returns a value. Now, if we continue our analogy with the cookie baking recipe, because remember, we talked about how a function is kind of like a recipe in that it acts like a set of steps that you follow in order. Now, I kind of did a little bit of a white lie, though, because I was always talking about this recipe producing something at the end, right? Namely, some delicious cookies. But actually, so far, none of the functions that we've written together actually return anything. So now I will introduce the concept of a return value. And if you're following along with the analogy of the cookie baking recipe, you could think of the return value as the delicious cookies that basically come out the other end once you've followed those instructions, basically. Now we can talk a little bit about, you've seen that in this callback, we have this kind of syntax here where we have an arrow and then the word void, okay? And if you've been paying close attention to the videos, you may have seen this in a couple other different areas. And what this is saying is, first of all, when you define a function, if you want to give your function a return value, all you have to do is after your function, after you put your parameters, you do an arrow, and then you put what type your function is going to return. So many times, it's common to see that our functions return void. And what this is basically saying is hey, our function actually doesn't return anything, right? It basically just follows the steps, does its thing, and it doesn't return anything. It returns void, right? But you can actually return any number of things. Let's think about our different types that we have, right? We could return maybe an integer. We could return a string. We could return a float, right? So just to kind of introduce this in a simple way, I'm going to, instead of void, I'm going to give our function a return value of bool, okay? So I remember from our discussion of types that a bool is basically true or false, right? And so what I'm going to do is we're going to use our level up function from last week. We're going to kind of continue that. And basically what I'm just going to do is I want to return a value. So the way that we execute this in GDScript is we simply write the keyword return, okay? And then you put the value that you actually want to return. And in this case, I'm going to return true. The idea being that if this function is successful, I want to go ahead and just return true as kind of a way of saying, hey, your function worked. I wouldn't really do this necessarily. This is just an example to show you, what the syntax is for returning a value, okay? So now that we know how to make our function return a value, and we're returning one here, then I guess the natural question is, where does this value go, And what's important to understand is that so far when we've called a function, we've tended to just, call it with this type of syntax, right? Where we do the name of the function and we do parentheses, right? Well, and then we need because our function has parameter, we need to say how many levels. We'll just level up once, okay? So this is one way to call our function. And this will work actually totally fine. So if we just run this, we should see that indeed everything kind of works the same, right? Barbarian's health after leveling up 1 times is 105. So that it doesn't seem to really change anything by doing this return value. But if I catch this return value in a container, then maybe we can do something with it. So I want you to, if you've been following along with this series, now is a good time to pause the video and think, what what of the concepts have we used in the past that would be a good container to hold something? Well, if you said variable, then congrats, right? Because that is our go-to container to hold information, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do var, and we'll call this level up OK. Okay. And we're going to kind of build this up in stages. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to statically declare this as a bool. Okay, so I'm basically declaring that this variable is a bool. Now, when a function returns a value like ours does, and then the function is called on the right side of the assignment operator, right? So the equal sign, remember from our discussion of variables, is the assignment operator. When that function is called from the right side of the assignment operator, the function's return value will be stored in that variable, okay? So watch this. I'm going to go ahead and print the value of level up OK. And so here, if we go ahead and run, you see that we printed true, right? Because what happened was our function ran, we returned true, right? We told GDScript that we were returning a Boolean. We caught it with our level up OK variable. And now that we caught it, we're free to do with whatever we want with this. So a real-time scenario for this might be a situation where maybe you have something in your game that could be successful, or maybe it won't be successful. For example, maybe in our Ghost game that we're making, maybe the player has a certain item that maybe stops the ghost from chasing them, right? So maybe we have some kind of function that handles that, right? And it returns true if the attempt was successful and false if the attempt was unsuccessful. Well, now that we have a return value and we can catch it in a variable, we can use that to basically drive some other code. So maybe some logic further on in the game might do something based on whether or not that attempt to deflect the ghost was successful or not. Okay? The last thing I want to talk about is, notice that I'm following our kind of idea of using static typing, but this is actually a good example of when we can actually use our inferred typing, okay? So just like our discussion of variables, where sometimes we can just use our colon equals assignment operator, we can actually do that here. Now, why can we do this? Why is this allowed? Well, remember, what colon equals does is it basically allows GDScript to infer the type, okay? So do we have enough information to infer the type? Well, yes, we do. You see, GDScript knows that the level up function returns a Boolean value. It will only return a Boolean value. If I try to return, like, for example, hello, we're going to get a problem. Because C cannot return a value of type string as bool, right? So GDScript is going to step in here and be like, yo, buddy, you're breaking the contract we had, right? You told me that this function was returning a bool. What are you doing trying to return something that's not a bool, right? That's basically what's going on here. By that logic, we can use colon equals because GDScript is smart enough to know that level up, it can only return a Boolean. Therefore, the level up OK variable must be a Boolean. We'll go ahead and statically type that to a Boolean for you, okay? So that's kind of the final piece of the syntax. So this is kind of typically what you'll see in our code base, is things like this, where we explicitly declare the return type, and then we use that to our advantage to let GDScript infer the variable type based on that return type. Okay, I hope that wasn't too much. It's a little bit confusing. The last thing I'll say, because I don't want to leave you dynamically typed folks out, you don't have to declare that way, right? So we could do this, for example. So what I'm doing is I'm basically, I'm not explicitly stating that the function returns a value. when you do that, you're free to go nuts. You can do whatever you want. Like I could return true, I could return hello, I could return a variable from inside my function, like for example, wisdom. Oh, well, actually, I guess wisdom's up here. I could return, for example, if I did a variable which was like my score and I made it like 1,000, I could return that, right? Now, this is really useful when you're maybe prototyping quickly. You don't want to have to worry about, uh, you just want to return a bunch of different things from your function. Like, for example, maybe sometimes you want to return a float, but then other times you want to return an int, right? You just want your flexibility. Well, that's totally fine. All you have to do is make sure that you don't declare a static type for your return value. Now, the problem that I run into with this is when your code base gets really large, it's when you've got thousands of functions in your code base, it's really, really useful to be able to know what type a specific function returns. And that way, it's easier to hunt down bugs. Because instead of thinking, oh gosh, is that a float or an int? Like, is a string trying to get added to an int somewhere? What's going on? It cuts out on a lot of that stuff, right? By explicitly stating your return types. So if you look at our code bases, you're going to see a lot of that kind of thing. In fact, we basically enforce it. Me and my twin brother do. We make sure that we are very explicit with each other about return values, okay? And if your game has any kind of scope in it whatsoever, I would highly encourage you to try to do the same. All right, so that's it for the concept. Let's take a look at return values in action in our code base. All right, so here we are in the beating heart of Keebs and Jeebs, Deputies of the Damned, which is our paranormal ghost hunting kind of phasmophobia inspired game. And I found an example that I'd like to show you all about return types. So let's look at this function here. This function is called match on item name. And to tie it in with last week's episode, we are taking one parameter, which is the item name, and that is of type string. And what this function does is it returns. Now, this is not a type that comes with Godot. This is a custom type for our game, items, right? And we'll talk more about custom types. I think we talked a little bit about it during our discussion of types, but we'll definitely get more into that as the series progresses. All you need to understand is that what I wanted to show you is that when you start having your own, custom types that are tailor-made to your game, a lot of times your functions will be returning those things instead of just an integer or a float. Now, I have lots of functions that return those things as well, but the cool thing is that when I look at this function, my twin brother, who's working on the game, can very easily say, aha, this function, I give it a string and it's going to give me an item, right? Well, that's something that almost anyone can figure out, including anyone on your team, right? And so when it comes to collaborating, with other team members, I mean, heck, even just, when you're looking back at your code base, maybe you haven't looked at this script in a month, right? Well, you're going to be able to remember exactly what this function does because of this return type, right? I bet you many of you watching this video can kind of figure out what this code does. Even if you're not like fully experienced with GDScript yet, you can kind of realize that this function takes an item name, right, in the form of a string, and it returns an actual item type, right? So you can see that here, right? So if the string name is flashlight, go ahead and return the flashlight item, candle, and so forth, right? So basically, we can fire up the game here and kind of show it in action. I'm just going to run a one-player game right now to make it a little easier to show. So here we are. So at the start of the game, there's actually a couple items on the ground here. Again, it's still very early on in this game, so it's still, I would say, heavily in prototype mode. But what's happening is when I go up to the item, right, and then I grab an item. Okay, I got the lighter, okay? So underneath the scenes, my match item on name function is being called. Because the reason why I need to do that is because in this game, there's very different behavior from the item that's in the world, like if I drop this candle, right? That item, even though it looks the same as the one in my hand, it's actually very, very, very different functionality. And that's on purpose because I'll just give you a simple example. The value for the light that the candle gives off when it's in my hand is much different than the value of the light that it gives off when it's on the ground. And that's intentional. Like they need to be different for them to each perform their job. So whenever I pick up an item in the game, what's actually happening is in one frame of the game, I'm deleting the item that's on the ground and I'm spawning the item that's in the hand. Now it looks to the player like they're just picking up the item, but it's a magic trick. You see, in the background, what the player doesn't realize is that I'm really, really, really quickly deleting one item from the game and really, really, really quickly creating an item in your hand. And in order for those things to match, what function am I using? Well, if you guessed match on item name, you were correct.